The last summer Winona Hartwell arrived in Red Hollow, the prairie seemed to be holding its breath. Heat shimmered above the wagon road, turning distance into liquid silver. Dry grass bent beneath a wandering wind, whispering through the valley like old women trading secrets. Cicadas sang from the cottonwoods, their chorus rising and falling beneath the lonely cry of a hawk. Far beyond town, the mountains rested beneath a pale blue sky, unmoved. A train whistle drifted across the open land, long and mournful, and something in its voice sounded to Winona like a farewell she had not chosen for herself. She stepped down from the station platform carrying a weathered suitcase and the remains of a life that had narrowed year by year. At 31, she had buried an aunt who had been her last family, sold the little house they shared, and followed a rumor of work westward. Her burgundy traveling dress clung uncomfortably in the heat, and sweat gathered beneath her collar, yet she kept her back straight. She had learned long ago that strangers noticed her size before they noticed anything else. If she walked with dignity, some called it stubbornness. If she smiled, some treated it as presumption. Still, hope had survived. Fragile, bruised, and persistent, it traveled beside her now, asking for one more chance. Red Hollow revealed itself slowly, a row of sun-bleached buildings gathered around a dusty main street. Men lounged beneath awnings, women moved between storefronts, and children darted through patches of shade. Winona paused outside the general store, reading the painted sign that bore the name Luke Remington. She had been told the merchants sometimes hired help during busy months. Through the window she saw shelves crowded with flour sacks, lanterns, bolts of fabric, and preserved goods. It looked like the kind of place where a capable woman could earn enough to begin again. She inhaled once, steadied herself, and pushed open the door. The bell above it chimed, bright and innocent, unaware of how quickly hope could be wounded in public. Conversation softened when she entered. Luke Remington stood behind the counter, broad-shouldered and neatly dressed, with the easy confidence of a man rarely contradicted. Several customers glanced toward her, then exchanged looks. Winona ignored them. She approached the counter and asked whether any positions were available. She explained that she could keep accounts, manage inventory, cook, clean, and work longer hours than most people expected. Luke listened for a moment, his mouth twitching. Then he leaned one elbow on the counter and looked her up and down. The silence stretched just long enough to make everyone watch. Finally he laughed. "Lady, shelves are already carrying enough weight." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the room erupted. Laughter bounced off the walls. Someone snorted. Another man repeated the joke. A woman covered her mouth while smiling. Winona felt heat rush into her face. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. She wanted to disappear, yet pride held her upright. She thanked him anyway because dignity was the only thing nobody could take without permission. She turned and walked out, slowly. Outside the afternoon seemed harsher, as though the sun itself had witnessed the exchange. Winona crossed the boardwalk and kept walking, but humiliation traveled beside her. Two boys near a water trough repeated Luke's remark and burst into laughter. A pair of women lowered their voices as she passed, though not enough to hide their meaning. By the time she reached the train platform again, the story already seemed to belong to the town. She sat on a weathered bench at the edge of the station and stared at the tracks stretching toward the horizon. Tears gathered despite her efforts. She thought of turning around, buying another ticket, and leaving before sunset. Nobody knew her here. Nobody would miss her. Yet the idea felt strangely familiar, another retreat in a life shaped by retreating. She lowered her head and listened to the wind. It carried dust across the platform and tugged gently at her sleeves, as though the land itself could not decide whether to welcome her or send her away. "Mind if I sit?" a voice asked. Winona looked up. An elderly rancher stood nearby, hat shading a weathered face lined by decades of sun and wind. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes carried the steady calm of someone who had endured more seasons than he bothered to count. She nodded. He settled onto the bench with a quiet groan and rested his hands on his knees. For several moments neither spoke. The train yard crackled softly in the heat. At length he remarked that Red Hollow could be unkind to newcomers. Something in his tone made pretense feel pointless. Winona told him what had happened. Not every detail, only enough for the shape of it to emerge. The rancher listened without interruption. When she finished, he scratched his jaw thoughtfully. Then a faint smile appeared. "Well now, miss, if I were 20 years younger, I'd marry you myself." A few people lingering nearby overheard him. They laughed, assuming it was another joke. The rancher, however, did not laugh. His gaze remained steady. Winona blinked. Surprise pushed through her hurt. For the first time that day, Someone had spoken to her as though she possessed value beyond ridicule alone. The rancher introduced himself as Wade Calloway. The name meant something even in a town she had only just entered. She had heard passengers mention the Calloway Ranch, a sprawling operation north of town known for fair wages and stubborn survival. Wade asked where she intended to stay. When she admitted she had not yet found lodging, concern flickered across his face. He questioned her gently about work, and she described the skills she had listed inside the store: bookkeeping, preserving food, household management, sewing, cooking. Wade listened with growing interest. By the end of the conversation he seemed less focused on her misfortune than on her capability. That realization unsettled her almost as much as his kindness. People usually saw what she looked like and stopped there. Wade appeared to be searching for what lay beyond first impressions. It was an unfamiliar experience, awkward and strangely comforting at once, like standing in unexpected shade after. After another moment, Wade said the ranch needed help. Summer work had piled up, and the woman who managed several household duties had recently left. He could offer wages, a room, and employment. Nothing more. Nothing less. Winona stared at him, uncertain whether to trust what she was hearing. The wounds of the afternoon were still fresh. People did not usually open doors after slamming them. Wade seemed to understand her hesitation. He rose, adjusted his hat, and told her to think about it. Then he started toward the waiting wagon. Halfway there he paused and looked back. "Miss Hartwell," he called. She lifted her eyes. "I wasn't joking." The laughter from the store echoed faintly across town, but somehow it sounded smaller now. As the evening light stretched across the tracks, Winona felt something shift inside her, and for the first time in years hope answered back. The following morning arrived on quiet feet. Dawn spread a wash of amber light across the prairie, turning every blade of grass into a slender thread of gold. Winona sat beside Wade Calloway in his wagon as Red Hollow disappeared behind them. The town shrank into a cluster of roofs and chimneys, yet its laughter lingered in her memory. She watched the road unwind through rolling fields and told herself she could leave if the offer proved another humiliation. Wade did not press conversation. He simply guided the horses and allowed silence to become something gentle rather than uncomfortable. By mid-morning the Calloway Ranch emerged from the landscape. A broad house stood near a windmill whose turning blades flashed in the sunlight. Barns rested beyond it, weathered but sturdy. Horses grazed in distant pastures, and cottonwoods lined a narrow creek where water glimmered between stones. The place felt lived in rather than impressive. Nothing demanded admiration. Everything suggested endurance. Winona sensed that Wade himself had shaped the ranch in his own image, not through grand gestures but through years of steady care. He showed her a modest room overlooking the pasture. The furnishings were simple, yet the bed was neatly made and fresh wildflowers stood in a small jar beside the window. Winona set down her suitcase and stared at the flowers longer than she intended. No one had prepared a space for her in years. The realization stirred an ache she could not name. Before leaving, Wade handed her a ring of household keys and explained her responsibilities. There was bookkeeping to organize, supplies to inventory, meals to plan, and preserved goods to prepare before autumn. He spoke with the calm expectation that she would succeed. That confidence felt strangely heavy, as though she had been entrusted with something valuable. Work quickly filled the days. Winona discovered ledgers neglected for months and spent long afternoons restoring order to them. She sorted pantry shelves, repaired records, and developed a system that allowed supplies to be tracked properly. In the kitchen she transformed ordinary ingredients into hearty meals that left ranch hands lingering at the table. She mended curtains, organized storage rooms, and brought quiet structure wherever confusion had settled. The labor exhausted her, yet it carried a different weight than the struggle she had known before. Each task completed became evidence that she belonged somewhere. Wade noticed more than he said. One afternoon she found a sturdy chair waiting beside the garden after mentioning that her knees hurt during long hours of preserving vegetables. Another day a wide canvas umbrella appeared near the washing line, casting a circle of shade exactly where she worked. He never announced these gestures. They simply materialized, practical and thoughtful. Winona began recognizing them as a language all their own. Wade was not a man who scattered compliments. He paid attention instead. As summer deepened, an unfamiliar ease settled over her. Meals were no longer negotiations with shame. She ate when she was hungry and stopped apologizing for existing. Laughter returned gradually, surprising her whenever it escaped. Some evenings she and Wade sat on the porch after supper, watching sunset spill crimson and violet across the horizon. Their conversations wandered through memories, mistakes, and stories of people long gone. Wade spoke of droughts survived, cattle lost, and winters that seemed endless. Winona shared fragments of her life with an honesty she rarely offered strangers. Neither pushed for confidences. Trust grew slowly, like roots finding water beneath hard ground. Yet Red Hollow remained close enough for gossip to travel. The first signs arrived through passing ranch hands who repeated comments heard in town. Some claimed Wade had hired Winona out of pity. Others suggested she had attached herself to an aging rancher because no younger man would want her. Winona pretended such remarks no longer mattered. In truth, they reopened wounds she had barely begun to heal. The old fear returned whenever she caught her reflection in a window. Perhaps acceptance here was temporary. Perhaps every kindness concealed a limit she had not yet reached. The tension sharpened during a church social held near the end of August. Wade encouraged her to attend, believing it might help her feel part of the community. For a brief hour she almost believed him. Lanterns glowed beneath cottonwood branches, music drifted through warm evening air, and families gathered around long tables laden with food. Then she overheard Millie Dawson speaking to a circle of women. Millie possessed the effortless beauty people admired without question, and her opinions traveled quickly through town. She remarked that Wade's generosity was being mistaken for affection. Another woman laughed and said no sensible man would confuse gratitude with romance, especially under such circumstances. The group glanced toward Winona. Their expressions carried the same judgment she had seen inside Luke Remington's store. The music continued, but something inside her folded inward. She left before anyone could stop her. The road back to the ranch stretched beneath moonlight, pale and lonely. By the time she reached the house, anger had given way to sorrow. She stood on the porch staring across the dark pasture, wondering whether Red Hollow would ever see anything except the shape of her body. The night air smelled of dry grass and distant rain. Behind her the screen door opened softly. Wade had returned earlier than expected. He studied her face, understood more than she said, and turned toward the horizon. "Funny thing about judgment," he murmured. "Folks spend so much time measuring waistlines they forget to measure character." Winona felt tears threaten again, but this time they came from somewhere deeper than hurt. For one fragile moment she believed him. Then Wade reached into his coat pocket, unfolded a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal, and quietly admitted that someone from his past was coming to the ranch. The name meant nothing to Winona, yet the unease in his eyes transformed the evening. Whatever was approaching carried history and consequences for both. 3 days after the letter arrived, Ethan Calloway rode into the ranch beneath a sky bleached white by relentless heat. Dust followed him across the yard like a second shadow. He sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered and composed, carrying himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to being respected before he spoke. When he dismounted, Wade's expression softened with a complicated mixture of affection and caution. Winona watched from the porch. Ethan removed his hat, greeted her politely, and introduced himself. His manners were impeccable. His eyes were not. They moved over her with assessment, measuring details and drawing conclusions he kept hidden behind a courteous smile. During supper he asked questions about ranch operations, finances, and household management. Wade answered most of them, proudly mentioning improvements made during the past months. Each compliment directed toward Winona seemed to tighten something inside Ethan. By the end of the meal, she understood the truth. He did not dislike her personally. He simply did not trust her. The following weeks unfolded beneath mounting pressure. Summer hardened. The creek narrowed. Pastures lost their rich color and faded toward brittle yellow. Every afternoon the sun pressed against the land with merciless weight. Ranch hands studied the horizon for rain clouds that never arrived. Dust settled over fences, wagons, and windowsills. Even the cattle moved more slowly. The drought threatened every ranch in the territory, and the Calloway Ranch was no exception. Wade carried the burden quietly, yet Winona saw it in the way he lingered over account books after dark. Expenses climbed while profits shrank. Feed had to be purchased. Repairs could no longer wait. Several neighboring ranches were already selling livestock below value simply to survive. Ethan stepped naturally into the crisis, reviewing contracts and calculating risks with sharp intelligence. His return should have brought relief. Instead it deepened an unspoken tension. He questioned nearly every decision connected to Winona. When Wade praised her bookkeeping, Ethan requested to examine the records himself. When she proposed adjustments to supply purchases, he asked whether she possessed sufficient experience. The challenges were never openly rude. That made them harder to confront. Each remark carried the implication that she occupied a place she had not earned. Winona responded the only way she knew. She worked harder. Long before sunrise she reviewed ledgers beside a lamp. She compared invoices, tracked waste, and identified expenses that had quietly drained resources for years. She discovered duplicate orders, neglected debts, and inefficient agreements with suppliers. The savings were not dramatic individually, but together they mattered. Wade trusted her findings immediately. Ethan remained skeptical until the numbers proved themselves impossible to dismiss. One evening he entered the study expecting to find errors in her calculations. Instead he found precision. Columns aligned perfectly. Figures balanced. Every recommendation was supported by evidence. For the first time uncertainty flickered across his face. Winona noticed it but said nothing. She had spent too much of her life defending her competence. Let results speak. Despite progress at the ranch, Red Hollow remained unchanged. The annual livestock auction arrived during the driest week of the season. Ranchers gathered to buy, sell, and negotiate before conditions worsened further. Wade insisted on attending. Winona accompanied him to help manage records. Ethan rode alongside them, reserved and thoughtful. The auction grounds buzzed with conversation. Dust swirled beneath boots. Animals shifted within holding pens. Beneath the noise, Winona sensed familiar scrutiny. Whispers followed her through the crowd. Some people remembered Luke Remington's joke. Others remembered church gossip. Acceptance, she realized, was fragile when built upon public opinion. Near midday she carried documents toward the registration table when Luke stepped into her path. Time seemed to slow. The merchant wore the same smug confidence he had displayed months earlier. Several townspeople stood nearby. They watched eagerly, anticipating entertainment. Luke glanced at the papers in her hands and laughed. "Careful," he said loudly. "Wouldn't want those ledgers collapsing under extra weight." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. The sound struck like an old wound reopening. For a moment Winona stood motionless. Memories flooded back. The store, the humiliation, the tears on the station bench. She felt every gaze settle upon her. Once, that attention would have shattered her composure. Once she would have retreated. But the woman standing in the auction yard was not the same woman who had arrived in Red Hollow. She lifted her head. The crowd gradually quieted. Luke's smile faltered. Winona looked directly at him and spoke with calm clarity. "A cruel tongue weighs far more than any woman ever could." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Not theatrical silence. The kind that arrives when truth lands exactly where it belongs. Several people lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Luke attempted a dismissive laugh, but it sounded hollow. The audience that had once encouraged him no longer seemed eager to join. Across the yard Ethan watched everything. Something changed within him during that moment. He had expected resentment, defensiveness, perhaps anger. Instead he witnessed dignity. He saw a woman absorb public cruelty without surrendering her self-respect. More importantly, he saw how naturally she could have humiliated Luke in return and chose not to. The realization stayed with him. Days later Ethan discovered another truth. While reviewing financial records, he noticed several recent payments whose source seemed unusual. Further investigation led him to a local broker. There he learned that Winona had quietly sold the last valuable possessions she owned, heirloom jewelry inherited from her aunt and a collection of keepsakes carried across the country. The proceeds had been used to cover emergency ranch expenses during the worst weeks of the drought. She had never mentioned it. She had never asked for repayment. She had acted because the ranch needed help. Ethan returned home carrying a shame heavier than any accusation. That evening he found Winona near the garden, gathering vegetables beneath a fading sunset. The sky burned with copper and rose-colored light. For several moments he struggled to speak. Finally he apologized. Not politely. Not strategically. Honestly. He admitted his suspicions. He admitted his arrogance. He admitted that he had mistaken kindness for weakness and generosity for calculation. Winona listened quietly. Then she forgave him. The simplicity of it struck harder than anger ever could. From that day forward, something resembling family began to emerge. Ethan consulted her opinions without condescension. Wade seemed lighter. Even the drought felt less oppressive, as though human burdens had shifted enough to make room for hope. Then one evening clouds finally appeared. Dark shapes gathered along the western horizon. Ranch hands stepped outside to watch. The scent of approaching rain drifted across the prairie. Relief swept through the property. But as the first distant thunder rolled over the land, Wade suddenly staggered on the porch. One hand gripped the railing. The color drained from his face. Winona reached him before he fell. Ethan rushed forward a heartbeat later. Together they caught him, and in Wade's frightened eyes Winona saw something far more alarming than drought, debt, or gossip. She saw a man confronting a weakness he could no longer hide, while above them the long-awaited storm finally began to break. Rain arrived in silver curtains that blurred the prairie and turned dust into dark ribbons across the yard. Through the storm, Wade Calloway lay awake in his room while thunder rolled beyond the windows. The rancher insisted he was merely exhausted, yet neither Ethan nor Winona believed him. Age and strain had been collecting their debts for years. The doctor from Red Hollow arrived after midnight, examined him quietly, and spoke with careful restraint. Wade would recover if he rested, but he could no longer carry every burden himself. The warning settled over the household like another storm still gathering. Morning brought clear skies but little comfort. The drought had broken, yet uncertainty remained. Wade spent more time indoors, surrendering responsibilities only because necessity left him no choice. Ethan assumed many duties, though he often sought Winona's counsel before making decisions. Their growing respect transformed the atmosphere of the ranch. Conversations that once carried suspicion now carried trust. Even so, Wade watched them with a reflective sadness that neither fully understood. Several times Winona caught him studying the horizon as though measuring time rather than distance. Something unspoken lingered behind his eyes, waiting patiently for its moment to emerge fully. Late summer gradually yielded to autumn. Golden light softened the fields and cool evenings carried the scent of harvested hay. During those quieter weeks, Winona became woven into ranch life so completely that she sometimes forgot the woman who had arrived clutching a suitcase in disappointment. Neighbors stopped seeking Wade and began seeking her as well. She helped settle disputes, organized donations for struggling families, and shared preserved food with households hurt by the drought. Respect spread slowly, yet it spread nonetheless, crossing fences and roads where gossip had once traveled faster than truth ever could. The change felt earned. Not everyone welcomed that change. Luke Remington remained unwilling to release old prejudices. Whenever conversation turned toward Winona, he dismissed her accomplishments as sentimental exaggeration. Yet his influence had begun to weaken. People remembered the auction. They remembered her composure and his embarrassment. Millie Dawson noticed the shift as well. One afternoon she approached Winona outside the church and offered an awkward apology. It was incomplete and imperfect, but genuine enough to matter. Winona accepted it without triumph. She understood that dignity required room for others to change too. That grace impressed witnesses more than victory would have done there. As the harvest festival approached, Red Hollow buzzed with anticipation. The celebration marked survival after hardship and drew families from miles around. Merchants decorated storefronts with ribbons and lanterns. Children rehearsed songs. Ranchers polished wagons. Despite the excitement, Wade seemed unusually contemplative. His strength had improved, yet fatigue still followed him. One evening he asked Winona to walk with him beyond the barn where cottonwoods overlooked the creek. There he spoke about loneliness, not dramatically but honestly. He admitted that after his wife's death he had stopped imagining happiness as something meant for him. The confession lingered between them quietly. Winona listened while water moved gently over stones. She understood loneliness intimately. For years she had mistaken endurance for living and survival for belonging. Wade never asked for sympathy. Instead he thanked her for bringing warmth back into rooms he had nearly forgotten how to inhabit. The words settled deeply. No declaration followed. None was needed. Their connection had been built through countless ordinary moments. Shared meals, repaired chairs, evening conversations, and mutual trust. Looking at him beside the creek, Winona felt something both hopeful and frightening unfold within her heart at last without shame or apology for its existence. Festival day arrived beneath brilliant autumn skies. Sunlight gleamed across freshly painted booths, and music drifted through town from fiddles and guitars. The streets overflowed with neighbors, visitors, and ranch families dressed in their best clothes. Winona almost declined to attend, fearing renewed scrutiny, but Wade insisted. Ethan agreed. Together they entered Red Hollow not as strangers bound by circumstance but as people connected by genuine affection. Faces that once turned away now greeted her warmly. Children waved. Shopkeepers smiled. Even those who had doubted her seemed eager to acknowledge her presence. The transformation felt almost unreal, yet every greeting. Near midday Marshal Wyatt Mercer stepped onto the festival stage and called for attention. Conversations quieted. The marshal announced that several citizens would be recognized for service during the difficult season. Winona listened politely, expecting nothing. When Wyatt spoke her name, surprise stole her breath. The crowd erupted into applause. Neighbors she had helped through hardship stood and cheered. Families she had quietly supported nodded through tears. The recognition was not for beauty or appearance. It was for kindness, competence, generosity, and steadfast character. Each word seemed to mend an invisible fracture carried for years beneath her smile and silence. When the applause faded, Wyatt invited Wade to speak. A hush settled over the square. Wade rose slowly and approached the stage. Age showed in his careful movements, yet dignity accompanied every step. He looked across the gathering before finding Winona in the crowd. Emotion softened his weathered features. Months earlier he had made a remark at the train station. Laughter rippled through listeners who remembered the story. Wade smiled faintly. Then he repeated the words exactly as he had spoken them that day. "If I were 20 years younger, I'd marry her myself." Silence followed immediately after that. Nobody laughed this time. Wade allowed the silence to linger before continuing. He admitted that age had never truly been the obstacle. Fear had. Fear of beginning again. Fear of risking loss after surviving it once already. Fear of believing happiness could return when life seemed determined to move only toward endings. His voice remained steady, but emotion threaded through every sentence. Then he looked directly at Winona and said that meeting her had reminded him that hearts do not obey calendars. They answer courage instead. The words hung luminous in the afternoon air before reaching her fully at last. Winona stood motionless. The crowd disappeared from her awareness until only Wade remained. Every humiliation she had endured seemed suddenly present and distant at once, like storm clouds dissolving beyond mountains. She remembered Luke's laughter, whispered judgments, lonely nights, and years spent believing herself unworthy of tenderness. Yet here stood a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning. Tears filled her eyes. She did not step forward dramatically or offer rehearsed words. Instead she simply met his gaze and nodded. The gesture carried gratitude, trust, affection, and hard-won self-belief. Sometimes lives changed not through speeches but recognition. The crowd erupted again, louder than before. Ethan smiled openly, pride replacing every trace of former doubt. Wyatt removed his hat. Even Millie wiped away tears she made no attempt to hide. At the edge of the gathering, Luke Remington stood silent and pale. For perhaps the first time he understood the cost of casual cruelty. Words spoken for amusement could follow someone for years. Winona noticed him briefly but felt no desire for revenge. The absence of bitterness felt like freedom itself. She had outgrown the need for his approval long ago already. At last she knew it completely. As music resumed and festivities continued, a messenger arrived from a neighboring ranch carrying urgent news. Several families faced imminent foreclosure after the drought. The announcement threatened to darken the celebration. Before concern could become despair, Wade stepped forward and pledged assistance from the Calloway ranch. Ethan immediately supported him. Then Winona offered the remainder of the harvest surplus she had carefully organized throughout the season. Others followed their example. Contributions spread through the crowd until what began as troubling news became a demonstration of community strength. Watching neighbors unite, Winona recognized another transformation. The town itself was changing too. Evening descended beneath a blaze of crimson and gold. Lanterns illuminated the square while dancers moved across packed earth. Wade and Winona found themselves briefly apart from the celebration, standing near the same train platform where their story had quietly begun. The tracks stretched westward into gathering darkness. Wade smiled at the memory. He admitted he had expected her to refuse his offer that day. Winona confessed she nearly had. They laughed softly. The sound carried warmth, relief, and wonder. Fate sometimes entered lives disguised as accidents. Neither seemed eager to challenge that mystery anymore. Again tonight beside those rails. A distant whistle echoed across the valley, haunting and familiar. The arriving train emerged as a ribbon of light beyond the hills. Winona watched it approach and thought of the frightened woman who had stepped onto that platform months earlier carrying grief instead of hope. She barely recognized her now. Wade gently took her hand. She squeezed it back. Around them music drifted through the autumn night while stars awakened above. Then Wade revealed one final surprise. He had rewritten his will that morning, leaving the ranch not merely to Ethan but also to Winona as family. Her breath caught.